to customer Y, where you start to discover that nobody wants your product, and they have the ability to turn around and start selling a product, very different product, to a very different customer, and do that overnight. And go back to your investors and tell them, listen, I know you signed up on this business plan, but you know what? We can try that for the next year and a half. Not going to work. Just going to change around. We're going to do something entirely different. That's already much harder. It's much easier in a way to continue and trying the same thing, and then at some point you can blame the market, you can take your time, but the ones that, the few circumstances and occasions we had in the past, I've been privileged to be with some guys who took very courageous decisions and turned around completely. It's also people, when you think about hiring people, Marca VIP is a company not unlike Trendyol, Marcafoni, and Limango. It's out there in the Middle East, more than 1 million members now. The company is 16 months live. We have 250 people working in the team, and we already fired 53 people. So we hired more than 300, fired 50. It's the same kind of attitude of, after a month or two, you discover that you didn't have the talent you needed, you turn around. Instead of giving people 7 other chances to do well, you turn around and you try to do better, and you move on. Some of these qualities we see come back to a higher extent than what I would call average. This is the team that, it's the Oracle Racing team that finally beat the other guys. Again, what we look for as a third quality, people who are nimble, who are fast, and people, and in particular, who look at products in a very iterative way. Trial and error. Try things, look at the market. Not go for perfection from day one. That's what we see a lot of the time happening in Europe. When I was working in the United States, I noticed that in general, people in the United States are not particularly much smarter. Why would they be? But in some ways, there's a couple of rules in the game that they tend to get a bit better than what we do in Europe. So they tend to go out with something that is imperfect, but take that feedback from the market and then see it as an iterative process. I've been in front of MBA students, I've been to Imperial College and a number of schools out there, and I'm always surprised to see how people really believe that you could have this plan for 2, 3, 4, 5 years out there and look that far ahead. In a startup, as you know, most likely, you can maybe look 1 or 2 months ahead. And you have to constantly adapt. It's not bad to try to have some business plan or some planning for the long term, but you need to try much, much more and do it continuously. And the last thing is something we see there, I call it paralysis by analysis, question mark, is that very smart people tend to have this habit of saying, you know what, next month we'll have more data, we'll have more of an informed decision. Why not wait another month and then, we'll be wiser. I've seen that happening to boards of directors, where smart people around the table tend to say, you know what, let's wait another few months and then we'll have more data, we'll make a better decision. It's hard to argue against that, but in many cases, at some point, you run with imperfection, you move faster, trial and error. So now we have 3 qualities outside of the comfort zone. People are very, very nimble, and people passionate about product and obsessed with detail. Is that enough? I guess not, because with all of those qualities combined, you have great people already, but sometimes people who end up being in a tunnel, being so deep down in the trenches that they lose some of the oversight. And that's why we're looking in particular for another quality, and I use the image of a chessboard, but in some ways it's a whole different kind of chessboard. Yes, it's about strategy, but not the type of typical strategy assignment where you look at a fast-moving consumer goods company, you got a few months to look at some different market analysis and move with that. What we like to see is people who have the ability to understand that while you're playing chess, the edges are growing at the chessboard and the rules are even changing, monetization is changing, and keep an eye on all of that. Have some kind of what we then refer to as, in this case, visionary, but in particular, we're trying to understand, do you have some kind of helicopter perspective, as I like to call it? Can you deal with all of that complexity? You have people who are pretty good at that, actually build a career around that, sometimes in strategy consulting, but then a lot of them are sometimes pretty awful when it comes down to the detail stuff, getting stuff done. And so what we will be looking for in the few exceptional entrepreneurs that we hope to identify is this quality of being at the same time a control freak and being a visionary. And we had that a few times. The guy I referred to, the guy who was at some point walking into a room, pushing a developer on the sidelines and trying to code himself, is also the same guy that we took to Sun Microsystems in front of their CTO a year and a half ago. His company was doing $1 million in revenues at the time, and he brought them a vision about where cloud computing was going to, and he told them why Sun was totally going in the wrong direction. And a few weeks later, Sun bought this company for around $60 million. Because of that vision. But not just vision, a number of these other qualities combined as well. So let's do the test. We've got 4 qualities. This guy showing up looking for funding. I think he would score pretty well on the 4 criteria that I just gave you. He's a guy who could have quite of an easy life, but tends to go outside of the comfort zone. He's obviously interested in some details, the way how he looks to start with, and with all of the toys. If you look at his movies, quite obsessed with detail. He's probably nimble and dealing with the much bigger picture. So you could argue, okay, I would want to have this guy. Now the problem we have so far is with these 4 criteria, if you do the same test on his nemesis, you would have to admit that his nemesis is also doing pretty well on those 4 criteria. And yet, I'm not sure if I want to fund this guy. In this case, I think Jack Nicholson, when he played the role of the Joker. So, we need, I think, an additional layer, an additional criteria that we like to use. And in this case, there's another guy with a mask, but this is Kobe Bryant of the LA Lakers, basketball. At some point, they even created a Kobe mask for him, I understand. But this is the type of person, and the slides, yes, here we go, who brings something else to the game, literally in this case, and it's what we refer to, more generally speaking, as leadership. He probably will bring all of these other qualities to the table as well, but there's something about leadership, and so many books written about leadership, I wouldn't want to dare try to nail this one. And I have to admit, this is also the one that for us is the most difficult one to really get a hold of. What is that leadership? We're not really looking for people who step in as macho leaders or generals and, pretend to be leaders in some ways. We're looking for people where some level of balanced ego is there. Enough ego to go out there and to withstand the pressure from the wrong investors, the wrong people. At some point, people also are willing to take a decision. High integrity. As I noticed before, and as I told you before, the people we're working with, in many cases, they're redefining the rules. These are people who have outsmarted the system and who think they can outsmart the system many times after. Before you know it, you end up with people who look a bit like the Joker. I'm not going to go public and say, but some people might even argue, well, in some cases, the Joker is the kind of guy also tends to build really big companies. Some people would say the Joker is the guy who put Microsoft together. I wouldn't go as far. I'm not saying that without some of those integrity skills, you wouldn't get to become a very successful entrepreneur. But what we see as investors is that introduces a level of risk that we don't always feel comfortable with. We like transparency. We'd like to be on the same page. We'd like to understand what goes wrong in a company. We don't want to have a good news show when we work with people. And for that, a minimum level of integrity is needed to avoid that you end up with egos who at some point start firing people at will because it's the wrong day of the week or it's not sunny outside. So this is a level, a 5th quality that we would add to the mix in terms of trying to find what we call exceptional entrepreneurs. So then the question is, great, how do you go about this? Do you have a methodology? And I have to say that's where it's getting a bit tricky, and it also, I think, explains why not many investors talk about this topic in public. You would find somebody like Brad Feld or Fred Wilson go out and talk about obsession for product, but usually that's where it ends. They stay a bit vague. And I think it's certainly because it's much easier to get wrapped up in discussions about market analysis, trying to look intelligent and talk product. And so I can see why we're spending a lot of time with entrepreneurs not talking about the thing that I think matters for 50 to 60 to 70% of what a successful company is, which is the basic founding team. Because you know what? It's easier to talk about these other things. So, for the purpose of today, conclusion. If I can give you any advice at all, I would say please all spend enough time talking about some of these difficult matters, the intangibles. It means that every now and then, if you're at least talking to us, you're going to have to deal with pretty embarrassing questions sometimes, because what I'm doing is, of course, I'm interested in the market, interested in the product, but I might throw in just a bunch of questions to see how people respond. I try to get them off that beaten track in a presentation where they do a dog and pony show by throwing in some really silly questions, meaningless questions at some point. Sometimes that the result are funny conversations. I once was interviewing somebody, and because I felt that I needed to ask something else than the usual, I said, "Sir, when is the last time you threw a piece of furniture at your colleague?" And so the guy turned all red. He felt that he was caught. And he at that point admitted, he said, "You know what, last week I threw my chair. How did you know?" Of course I didn't, but the thing is, once you start asking some of these questions, none of us are actually really comfortable talking about some of these things, because it goes back to pretty personal stuff. It also explains why sometimes investors, when they're talking to you, there is some time needed, not only to try to understand the market better, but also trying to understand for ourselves, with the little telltale signs that we got to see, what kind of a person we're dealing with. That takes some time. It also explains why if people come back to you and they tell you why they're not investing, in general people would come back and say, "Dear Barend, we really enjoyed meeting you, but we're afraid you really are operating in a crowded market." See, most of the cases, there's a chance you have this crowded market, but most of the cases there's a good chance that somehow we think that you're good, you're really good, but maybe you're not the exceptional guy that we think is gonna make that difference. So, tough topic to talk about, but if you're looking for co-founders, I would say try to look at that. It's easy to lower the bar. We've done that before as an investor as well, where we found great opportunities, we see the business opportunity at the horizon, and we know that something ain't entirely right, but we see all that goodwill, this energy, the passion, and you want to see it happen. And then we invest thinking, you know what, maybe we'll have some other guy in our network we can bring to the team and we'll fix that one thing. And in hindsight, well, we've made many mistakes in doing so. It's not that easy to fix. So now, at least for the last few years, we really try to bring the bar up again and think about this and say, okay, maybe it's a great opportunity out there, but we need to focus harder on what type of people do we think are going to make a difference. Voilà, this is coming to the end of the presentation. I would say if you think you have what it takes, you're invited. We're looking for talent. People who have less than a perfect business plan are also invited to talk to us. There's quite a few opportunities out there that we think are very exciting the next few years, and we're happy to match up any talent with other co-founders if we can. And with that, I will leave it to Arda, and I want to thank you for the presentation.
Barend, it was a great presentation, thank you. Actually, we still have a little bit of time, actually, and maybe we can get some questions from audience if you have, and after that we're going to start with Stefan's presentation. So, do you have any questions? You're all tired? Oh, there's a question.
Yeah. Perfectly clear? No, not.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was very clear, the message, well, the overall traits of a perfect entrepreneur that you've defined. I don't know how, being a control freak and a visionary could sit all together into one personality, but still the message was quite clear. One question with regards to, people from different geographies in the world obviously have different cultural traits, right? Like Hofstede's, the way he differentiates different cultures, maybe it has some sort of a relation with how you define the traits of an entrepreneur. Like a Japanese guy might be quite well different from a South American guy who might potentially be a little bit different compared to a German guy. They all have very, very different perspectives. How do you find, with respect to this geography, Eastern Europe or Middle East, this geography, the entrepreneurial traits that you find out so far in the people that you met so far, how do you see these people?
That's a broad question. I'll see if I can add some meaningful comments to that. You're right, it's quite different. I lived and worked in the United States, came back to Europe around the year 2000 to set up a venture capital fund. And now the last few years we feel blessed operating in this region, although in many ways we're outsiders. We just have a few really smart people now with Turkish roots in the team, but as you noticed, my Turkish is absent, and so what do I know of the local culture? It's a fair point. I think at the same time, I see it as a bit of a strength to be able to come also as an outsider, where we've noticed that people out here tend to be willing to go through a wall more than the comfort zone, which is called Europe. You'll find extremely hardworking people in the Valley and in the States as well, but frankly, I think some of that it felt a bit absent in good parts of the European market. So there's a number of qualities that when I look at on the screen, I try to have it in such a way that culture or being extremely extrovert, where that doesn't really matter all that much, but it's a learning curve. The first time when we came to Istanbul a few years ago with Pamir Gelembi setting up a conference to have the first look at technology companies, I noticed at the time when we were looking through traditional glasses and criteria in terms of where the kind of people we're looking for, we would come from a quite mature ecosystem. So ideally, if you look at our portfolio, half of our investments were serial entrepreneurs, people who had done that before, people sometimes in their 40s. And so in the beginning, we were a bit surprised because some of the things that we would be looking for, we wouldn't find. So we were obliged, and I think investors coming from abroad are obliged much more to look at raw talent. And maybe they will be forced also, if they haven't already done it, to try to do an exercise like the one I just took you through. And it's quite hard. So it's quite hard to judge. And I have to say, as a good example of that, at some point I met some girl, lady, who said that she would like to drop out of Harvard and set up a company called Trendyol. And she showed me the first presentation, I think, together with Pamir. And at the time, I was also still looking at it certainly from a perspective of the outsider, coming from a more mature ecosystem, thinking, well, you know what? Wow, all that ambition, we'll see. We'll see in a few months. We'll have the time. And so in that regard, we learned a few lessons. We were not on board in the case of Trendyol, but we tried to look at this region more in terms of raw talent. But there's certainly a challenge. It's probably one of the biggest challenges, ones that you have identified some of the talent. If you look at Cicexepity and P Games now, is that it is a challenge to hire the first layer of senior management. It is almost impossible, in my view, to find a good CFO for startups. What we see a lot, for example, are people who are great accountants or controllers. But what we're looking for are the kind of people who proactively start challenging business models internally, and who at some point also could step up to the CEO, founder, usually God in this case, and say, you know what, over my dead body. That type of CFO, mature enough to do all of that and combine all of those analytical skills, are very hard to find. So yes, step one is finding great talent, but at the same time, step two and finding great teams and scalable teams, that's a big challenge, much more so than in other parts of the world. And it's one of the things that we spend a lot of time on trying to help our companies with. Did I nail 5% of the answer you were looking for, or 1%, or did I even come close? Thank you. Any other question in the room?
I guess no. Thank you, Barend, for coming and giving us this great speech. And I hope after the event you come up to that Piola.
Yes, please.
We'll be
let's
there.
have a coffee together.
Have a couple of drinks. If you want to join us, we'll be there. Okay, so thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.